We found the above message scrawled into the snow on our doorstep. Someone must have written it recently, because the snow was falling heavily enough that it'd only be covered in a few minutes. I looked around us at the surrounding houses, but all the doors were sensibly shut. No one else was outside. We'd moved to Pennville from the city because we wanted to live in a small, quiet, and peaceful town, where nothing ever happened. Go figure. I had no idea who the culprit could be. My wife said, joking, "Do we think Santa did this?" I tried to return her smile, but it took serious effort. The message troubled me more than I wanted to admit. Frankly, although I never say so out loud, the snowmen in this town creeped me the fuck out. We hadn't built one in our front yard. No, like all the rest of them. It had popped up overnight, fully grown. When I mentioned it to our next-door neighbor, Mike Katz, a thin and hard-faced man who was in his late 60s, he dismissed it as the work of a bored teenager. "Don't let it bother you," he said, brushing off my attempts at helping him shovel snow off the driveway. "Kids in this town have nothing better to do than to drink and cause trouble." All of the snowmen were identical. Each one had 2 big black buttons for eyes, nubs of carrots for noses, and 2 twig arms. Whoever had created them had also lent them an army of black felt hats and gray scarves. If it had been up to me, I would have long since destroyed the snowman in our front yard, stomping it until it reverted back to harmless pieces of snow. But Emily loved them. She thought they were adorable. As I looked into the black eyes of the snowman in our yard, revulsion crawled over my skin. Its eyes threw back distorted reflections of our Christmas lights. They seemed to say, "I know something you don't." I was being dumb, but Emily wrapped one arm around me, giving me a curious glance, and I realized that the silence between us had stretched out too long. I tore my gaze away from the snowman and said, "Santa probably had one of his elves do it. He's too busy for this kind of crap. You know, millions of houses to break into, hundreds of thousands of chimneys to stuff himself down, kids to turn into coal." She laughed. "Come on, Ellie, let's go. It's freezing out here." I allowed her to guide me back inside, but I threw a glance over my shoulder to read the message again, and saw that a fresh layer of snow had already buried it. Skrrr. Skrrr. A loud scraping noise woke me up. I remained under the covers for a few minutes, my drowsy mind unable to figure out the source of the noise. The Christmas lights we'd also hung up around the bedroom threw blinking patterns of light across the walls. I rolled over, arms outstretched, and realized that the other side of the bed was empty. Emily must have gotten up. She often struggled with insomnia, and it was a normal occurrence to find her curled up in an armchair in the middle of the night, reading a trashy romance novel and drinking chamomile tea. The noise repeated itself, right as I was about to fall back to sleep. It set my teeth on edge, like listening to nails on a chalkboard. By now I'd pinpointed its location. It came from the bedroom window. Probably a tree branch scratching against it. I yanked the pillow over my head, but that didn't help muffle the noise. With every loud, repetitive skrrr, sleep danced further out of my reach. Finally, I gave up and fumbled for the clock on my nightstand. The glowing numbers told me that it was close to 4 a.m. Unbelievable. I sat up and threw the pillow on the ground, determined to snap that annoying tree branch in half. When I looked out the window, my blood turned to ice. A snowman stood right outside, its face pressed up against the glass. Its arm tapped at the window, and its black button eyes shone with a malevolent intelligence, an alien cunning. Its mouth had been stretched into an obscene leer, the buttons more widely spaced than before. And then, rational thought reasserted itself, and I shook off the lingering cobwebs of unease. Someone had looked in on us sleeping and decided to play a prank. That was all. Anger followed swiftly on the heels of that realization. I staggered over to the window on legs that felt like stiff wooden stilts, and jerked the curtain closed in one quick motion. As soon as the snowman disappeared behind the rough, dark cloth, I could breathe again. It wasn't tapping at the window. The wind moved his arm, and some complete asshole thought it would be funny. Even so, I didn't want to stay in the bedroom anymore. And I could forget trying to fall asleep. If Emily was still awake, I'd tell her what happened, and we could laugh about it together. I walked down the hallway that led to the living room, turning on one light after another. My heart slowed its frantic pace as the hard fluorescent lights clicked on and banished all the shadows. Christ, it was cold in here. Had Emily opened a window and forgotten to close it? I turned the corner and stopped. Stopped thinking, stopped walking, even stopped breathing. A thick trail of blood covered the floor, leading from the armchair in the living room to the kitchen. Blood dripped down into the cracks between the wooden boards of our floor and stained the edges of our cream-colored rug. After an interminable amount of time, I managed to say, "Emily? Are you there?" No response. I went back into our bedroom and dialed 911 with shaking hands. I don't remember exactly what I said to the dispatcher, only that she needed to send people here now. Then, that done, I got the Glock 21 out of our gun safe. If the person who had done this to Emily was still around, I'd need the gun. A loud buzzing noise filled my head, and I couldn't stop flinching every time the wind rattled the windows in our small house. After leaving the bedroom, I followed the trail of blood, my mind still reeling in disbelief and in shock. Only hours earlier, we'd been joking around and discussing our plans to see Emily's parents for dinner. Surely the world would return to normalcy at any moment, right? "She's dead," whispered a cold and matter-of-fact voice inside my head. No one can lose this amount of blood and still be alive. I shoved it aside, refusing to acknowledge it. She couldn't be dead. She couldn't. More blood covered the kitchen floor tiles, counter, and stools. It painted the walls red. Some of it had even splattered across the ceiling. I noted all of this, but didn't slow down. The trail led out the front door, which was wedged open a few inches because of a scarf that had caught at its bottom. A very familiar scarf, though it took my mind a few minutes to figure out that I'd last seen it wrapped around the snowman in our front yard. It was so sodden with blood that it looked black instead of gray. I dropped it with a cry of disgust, pushing my way out the front door into the howling darkness of the storm. "Emily!" I screamed my wife's name, and the wind whipped it away from me. I took a couple of steps forward. Snow fell thickly into my eyes, blinding me, and I swiped it away impatiently. Panic gnawed at my stomach like a frenzied, hungry rat. "Emily! Can you hear me?" The wind rose to a high-pitched shriek, drowning out my voice, and I stopped. I would have given anything to see Emily's face right now. Despair threatened to swallow me, and I told myself to get a grip. The police might already be on their way, but I had no intention of wasting any more time. I'd go out and search for her myself. I'd search the entire town if I had to. Decision made, I headed back inside, eager to grab my car keys and get going. A snowman barred the way. It couldn't have been there before. I would have seen it. It was ridiculously tall, made of 7 or 8 lumps of snow stacked together instead of 3, and stained with blood. So much blood. I swallowed hard, digging my nails into my palms. Someone must have put it here. Maybe the same someone who had hurt Emily. Impossibly, the snowman moved. Its long, stick arms stretched out as if reaching for me. I backed away, my stomach sick with dread, unable to even scream. Terror had punched all the breath out of me. Part of me clung to the idea that this was an elaborate setup, that this couldn't actually be happening. But a larger part of me remembered the message from earlier. The snowmen hunt at night. Every time I looked away and advanced on me, I couldn't tell how it was moving forward, only that it was. For every 3 steps I took backward, it took 1 step forward. Eventually, I nearly tripped over myself because I didn't dare take my eyes off it. A cold gust of wind sent the front door banging against the wall, and I cringed away despite myself, nearly sending a bullet straight through the floor. I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. More snowmen had gathered outside. Their button eyes glinted under the Christmas lights. Going out the front door wasn't going to work. They'd simply surround me, pull me down. And what? As if in answer to my question, the snowman's entire body began to transform. It rippled, melting and reforming. The black buttons that served as its mouth exploded off of it, shooting in every direction and bouncing off the walls. Its twig arms fell to the floor, and 4 long limbs made of snow and ending in sharp, icy claws took its place. A hole opened up in the middle of its featureless face, right below its button eyes, and gaped impossibly wide. Needle-sharp teeth lined its mouth in concentric circles. It shot towards me, moving impossibly fast. Adrenaline rushed through me. I raised my gun and shot it. 3 times, 6 times, 9, and then it was on me. Its weight knocked me off my feet, and I slammed into the wall painfully, nearly losing the gun. I tried to shake off the purple spots that swarmed at the edges of my vision, knowing that if I didn't get up right now, it'd kill me. I managed to scramble up to my feet before it descended again, viper quick. Its mouth closed over my outstretched arm instead of my hand, swallowing both it and my gun. I continued firing into it, not sure how many rounds I had left. The gun clicked empty, just as a sharp, piercing pain shot through my shoulder. It retreated, and I stared uncomprehendingly at the bloody stump that was now my arm. It had bitten my hand and part of my arm off. It had swallowed the gun, too. My knees unhinged, and I slid down the wall, landing hard. This was the end. I was going to die here. It lowered its head, preparing for the final strike. When I met its button eyes, I saw a whole winter wonderland in them, a magical place where Christmas never ended. But the people there weren't happy. They huddled next to each other, their faces drawn in agony and misery. There were hundreds of them. Someone familiar stood at the front, her lips blue, her hands black and frostbitten. The tears froze on her face even as she cried. A huge, monstrous beast that wore red and white prowled on the edges of the group. His breath steamed the air. I couldn't see what he looked like clearly, but I did understand that this place was his den, his feeding place. Abruptly, sirens wailed close by, dragging me to myself. As I watched, the thing that had been a snowman tilted its head to one side and scuttled away from me, heading out the front door. It was leaving. Hopefully, it would never come back. This time, I didn't fight the waves of dizziness swamping me. I let myself pass out. After the hospital released me, I did some investigating of my own, hitting up the town library and combing through old newspaper articles, journals, and books. The police were completely uninterested in my version of events, and I can't blame them. I know how crazy I sound, but get this. It turns out that Pennville isn't so quiet and peaceful after all. Every year since the early 1900s, people have gone missing on Christmas Eve. It's usually only one person, but sometimes it's entire families. And I noticed something else after I left the hospital. All the snowmen were gone from everyone's yards. Even their hats and scarves have completely vanished. I tried to talk to Mike about it, since I figured that he has to know about what's going on here. I might as well have tried to talk to a brick wall. Other than telling me to move away, he wouldn't say anything. He shut the door in my face. Again, I know how crazy I sound. Everyone wants me to move away, or at least shut up. But in 1 year's time, I'll prove it to you. I plan on staying right here until next year's Christmas Eve rolls around. If I'm right, the snowmen will reappear in everyone's yards, like magic. And when they do, I'm going to find some way to bring my wife back here.